Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Tuesday, October 8th, 2024, and we are continuing our best farm advice ever week. And we have our first guest host who has given me lots of great farming advice. It's my dear friend, Jennie Love, who is also one of the best growers I know. She's a farmer out of Philadelphia, PA, and is going to join me today to give us some of her best advice. And although Jennie is a flower farmer, we do not talk flowers today, really. Instead, we are talking, well, mostly water. One note that if you enjoy this, Jennie regularly hosts field days at her awesome farm, like the No-Till Flowers Field Day coming up here in November on the 8th, that I will link in the show notes. Otherwise, let's do it. Jennie Love, welcome to Growers Daily. You are my first guest ever on the show.
Wow.
And you're my first guest host. That's so exciting.
It
how are
is exciting. I'm good. I'm delighted and humbly honored to be the first guest on the Daily Show. That sounds very, very important. So thank you.
Well, thank you. How's Philly?
Very dry. So yeah, we are in a bad drought here and it's been a tough growing season. So I think maybe we'll touch on some of that in this conversation. Been one of the harder growing seasons I've ever had, actually. So yeah.
Yeah, we're kind of in the same boat. It was just dry. And it was after it was dry, it just stayed dry. And then it got drier.
It keeps getting drier. Like right now, I don't know if everybody can hear it, but there's a terribly windy day happening here that is just blowing hot wind. It's like being under a hairdryer. It just won't stop, this hot wind.
So with the hurricane stuff, you didn't get any of that?
No, we ended up with just this like stretch of about 4 days that were just misty and cloudy, but no real accumulated rain, which, I'm so grateful we didn't get the flooding and I have so many thoughts about, North Carolina, but yeah, nothing really here, no measurable amount of rain. So we're just sitting dry since the beginning of August. So yeah.
Yeah, that's rough. It was for us, it was completely dry until the hurricane. That was like the one thing that kind of got us out of it, because I think we got like 4 inches of rain or 5 inches of rain, I guess, over that.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like in 20 hours or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty stormy here. It felt like being on the outskirts of a hurricane.
Yeah.
But yeah, we didn't get it super bad. Obviously, nothing like what they got in North Carolina. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. So I guess maybe we're going to end up talking water today. So that'll be fun.
We were talking water today. It is front and center of my mind. You're like, what do you want to talk about? I'm like, water. So that all I can think about anymore is water.
That was heavy on my mind this summer.
Yeah.
It's just, so I guess we'll just start with like the whole theme of the week being kind of like big advice that sort of changed something about your farm.
Yeah.
And we'll do like one technical one, and then in the middle we have a question that pertains to water, so it's perfect, from a Patreon member. And then at the end I'll let you give maybe more of a bigger picture sort of piece of advice that changed your life, your farm life to some degree. So let's start there. What's in terms of like a technical piece that you've received over the years that like really made a difference for you?
I think this isn't necessarily something I received, but it's something I want to give to people who are listening, particularly newer farmers, but even farmers who are in a phase of expansion with their farm, perhaps. But just thinking about water, of course, we all know we need water to grow. That's not rocket science, but understanding how much water might be needed, or just generally that there's extremes in water. Like there's so many extremes, and it's becoming more and more prevalent where, like we said, we've got, horrifying flooding right next door to extreme drought. And you can go from one to the other in one season. Like here in Philly, we actually had extremely heavy rainfall in the beginning of the year. And now it's just like this crazy drought. And it's so hard for us to steward soil and steward ecosystems without a really solid game plan for water. And so some of the like bits of advice I have are just first and foremost, like before any sort of like if you're buying land or you're considering expanding your production in some way, or even just like changing enterprises or putting extra infrastructure in, whatever it might be, like you can often, I know I'm speaking from experience here, you can often get carried away in the excitement of like, I'm getting this thing, I'm making this dream come true, I'm going to make this happen, I've thought about this for a while. And then this reality can come crashing down on you where you're like, oh, I never thought about the water that is necessary to support that expansion or this new addition or whatever it is, or vice versa, build something and then horrible flooding or horrible torrential rain comes and wipes it out. So I think it's just important to have a game plan right from the beginning. So one of the things that's happened here for me this season is I started this new enterprise that is a wholesale flower collective. So for veggie farmers, you know what food hubs are. In flower farming, we have things called flower collectives where we're selling as a group of growers and reaching a bigger marketplace, which is really awesome. It's worked really well. But one of the things I didn't think about is how much water that would take out of my own farm system because I'm hosting it at my farm. So we're going through hundreds of gallons of water a week that I had not accounted for. And then that's literally draining my farm dry, which is impacting my crops. And, you know, so it's just a domino effect from there. So just want people to think a little bit more carefully about water and what your sources of water are. So does that make sense, Jesse? Is that, you know, ring true?
Oh, absolutely. It's interesting, like when we talk or think about scaling, that honestly doesn't, even as somebody who makes recommendations for people who are scaling a lot of times, water doesn't always cross my mind because I know for you, it's pretty much, we're in like a very similar climate. And so oftentimes we're fine on water. Like it's just not like it'll get dry for a little while, but then we'll get a 2 or 3 inch rainfall and we're kind of back to, you know, go. But then there are these times like this year for us and then this year for you that the rain just never comes and you end up in a situation where you're using a lot more water anyway. That's something I honestly hadn't really put much thought into.
Yeah, and the thing is, a lot of times people think like, I'll find a way to get more water. So, but drilling a well is really expensive if you go to the route of drilling a well. Or I know a lot of urban growers are on municipal water, and you're just like, whatever, I'll just, it's an endless supply of water. But water, particularly in a municipal situation, is very expensive. So if you're scaling up and your scale up is going to involve needing a lot more irrigation, like the cost of that gallon per water might not pencil out for how much it's going to, like, are you going to really be profitable by scaling if you have to use a lot more water? And if you are, like, if you can make the numbers work, then so be it. You're just maybe going to have to price out your crop a lot higher to support the additional financial burden that all of that water is going to come with. So just something to think about. And then if you are on a well or you have, you want to dig a well, NRCS has grants for wells. So that's something I wanted to make sure everybody knew about. If you're considering digging a well, approach NRCS to get funding for that. And if you are in a municipal situation, you might think like, oh, I can't have a well, but you might be able to. I was able to dig 3 wells here in Philadelphia without a permit, for the record. You don't even need a permit to dig a well in a city or my city. So it might be one of those things you want to think about too, even if you're an urban grower in a municipal space. If it's your own land and you could, in theory, fund the well, you might want to actually dig a well, even if you're in a city, because then that water does not cost so much if you can get, say, the NRCS grant or whatever. There's just different ways to think about your water sources and the funding of getting a good water source. Because one of the things that's happening here at my farm, I've been farming for 16 years, for a lifetime, essentially. I've been running my own farm for 16 years, but I grew up on a farm. And this year I'm losing thousands of dollars of crops, thousands of dollars of harvest because I can't keep everything watered. And so it feels when you build infrastructure for a farm at any point, it can feel really daunting and intimidating. Like, oh, I don't know, like digging a well, this seems hard, this seems complicated, I don't know what I'm doing. But what's the point of planting all of that stuff if you're not going to be able to harvest it, if you're not going to be able to sell it? I mean, there's really no point in doing any of it if you don't start with that infrastructure.
Yeah, that's it's such a difficult situation. So is it just wells that you're working off of, or are you using municipal too?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just a well. So, ironically, even though I'm in the heart of Philadelphia, the municipal water does not run to my property because it's cut off by land that's in conservation, which is great. But I am not near a water line. So, I am relying just on wells, and all of my wells do not yield much water at all. So, you're supposed to have, I think the recommendation from Penn State, which is our land grant university, is something like 28 gallons a minute or something for a farm. And my well gets 4 gallons a minute.
Oh, wow.
So it's pretty laughable, honestly. It's something interesting to deal with for sure.
So did you do anything this year that was like sort of on the fly water collection sort of stuff, or what did that?
Yeah. I have a rain barrel. So this is a question everybody asks me when I start telling them how sad the water situation is here. I do have rain barrel collections off of structures at the farm, and it's about 1,000 gallons of collection. But the problem is you go through 1,000 gallons of water really fast at a farm, like really fast, like within a week. And so if it doesn't rain, a rain barrel does not actually help you. So that's like another, I guess, a little bit of advice for those who are considering, usually starting up a farm, you're like, oh, I can just do a rain barrel. I can, I'll make it work. But like that is not a long-term, like, solid game plan for running a business for sure. I mean, yeah, if it's more of a homestead farm, so be it. But if you really want to make legitimate money out of this, you can't rely on a rain barrel, because when the rain stops, the water stops. And another thing about rain barrels is they're great for irrigation, but in flower farming, we have to have a lot of very clean water. And I'm sure with veggies too, you have to have a lot of clean water for processing, so you can't wash your veggies in algae stagnant water, which sometimes the rain barrel's pretty gross.
Yeah, not the best. Not the best for veggies.
Yeah, and so also same here, we can't cut flowers into buckets of slightly gunky bacteria-filled water. We have to have clean, fresh water for that. So rain barrels have their place, and you can also get funding through NRCS for that. Like NRCS can provide funding for putting gutter systems on your greenhouses or high tunnels, and they can fund the cisterns that you would buy, the barrels that you would buy. So there is funding for setting those up, but it is not necessarily a rock solid alternative for sure. So yeah.
Last thing I'm curious about with this, was there any place on your farm or any soil management practice that you felt like through that drought you were like, oh, okay, this is standing up a little better?
Yeah, well, as always, those living pathways, we've talked about them before, Jesse, you and I, on past episodes, but living pathways just really hold that moisture into the ecosystem. So anywhere around the farm that has more exposed soil, I'm talking like there's not much on my farm, but like the driveway, or there might be a place where some critter was scuffling up some soil and left it bare. And those places are so dry that I feel like we're in the Dust Bowl. I mean, I don't want to compare us to that tragedy, but it is starting to just be like, oh my God, how can this be so dry? But then where there is, living plants, particularly those living aisles, those walkways, they really keep a sense of humidity right at the soil surface. So that has been super, super helpful. And then we're using pulse watering, which I think we're going to talk about in the next segment. So I'll talk more about it then. But pulse watering has made a huge difference for us as well. And being able to just keep that soil a little bit moist, at least is keeping the soil biology alive. Some of our plants, there's just no they just require more water. It's like, imagine growing tomatoes without a solid water source. Like, you're not going to get high production. You get a little bit of production off of them, but not high production. So some of the crops, we're not having a great year with them, but at least I can tell the soil is still alive. And I know that, at least I'm being a good steward to the land still.
Yeah. Well, that does make for a good opportunity to segue into our next question. So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll get a listener question from our Patreon members. BRB. Today's episode is brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. Okay, back with Jennie Love. So for our second segment, I have a specific question about pulse watering. I know you'd mentioned that in the last segment, but that was actually a question that came up in our Patreon question. So if you, the listener, want to support our work, you can do so at patreon.com/no-till-growers. That is the best way to support our work. I will try to get questions from everywhere that questions come in, but Patreon members will always get first dibs on those questions. And our first question, or our question today, comes from Kimberly Monaco, who says, I'm interested in learning about pulse watering with drip tape. I am a no-till backyard cut flower and vegetable grower. So not really a question, but Jennie, maybe learn us a little bit on pulse watering. What is it? What is your experience with it? Do you recommend all those things?
Yeah, I do. Well, yes, highly recommend it. So we'll start at the beginning. Pulse watering is a system of irrigating that involves injecting just small pulses of water into your soil through irrigation, through drip irrigation, small pulses multiple times a day. So as a trained horticulturalist, I was always taught, like, you should water deeply. That's how you get deep roots, and you water deeply. And you do, like a long, deep soak, once a week with irrigation or however you're watering. And that does work if you are in a stable climate and, all the conditions are right. But so frequently now, we are not in stable climates, and it also depends a lot on soil type. So for me, if I deeply water for, an hour or two at a time, once or twice a week, what happens is that water just goes straight down through the soil profile. It finds the path of least resistance, and it goes as far down as it can. Now, the unfortunate reality is that most plant roots are within the top 6 inches of soil. So if that water doesn't stay in the top 6 inches of soil, it's not doing your crop any good. Now, if you have perennials, it can help some with perennials a little bit, but generally speaking, if you're growing annual crops, you need that water to stay ideally somewhere between 1 inch deep and 4 inches deep is pretty much the happy spot. That's where the roots are. So with pulse watering, what happens is it helps it by doing just little pulses. So we're talking 4 or 5 minutes at a time, 4 or 5 times a day. So it ends up being about 20 minutes a day, or it really depends on your system, your soil, and all that stuff. But that's what I do. Then what that does is it's through the capillary action. So water molecules have, an attraction to each other. And through capillary action, they stick together and they kind of form more of a net instead of a channel. So if they're just constant dripping, just going straight down, it's like a river. It's like a stream. There's just a constant movement of water. But if the water is just little spurts, then it spreads out more. It spreads out in the soil profile where your plant roots are. So that is the value of pulse watering. I was schooled in pulse watering on my own podcast, No Till Flowers, by a flower farmer in Australia, Emma Horswell. That was episode 39. So if anybody wants to go listen to it, it's an awesome episode, by the way, for flower farmers and any farmers.
We'll link that in the show notes, and high recommendation for me. I always loved your podcast.
Yeah, that was such a cool conversation too with Emma. She has so much knowledge to share. So in that podcast, we really go into detail about pulse watering. And she got it from another grower in Australia named John Menzel. And I think he took it from nut tree growers or something in Australia. But anyway, it originated in Australia where they really don't have a lot of rainfall. And so it's a way to really conserve water. It's a lot less stress on your water source. Like if you have a pond or you have a well or whatever your source is besides municipal water, it's a lot less stress. It conserves a lot of water. So in the end, if you do your gallons used, I don't know the exact percentage, but it's drastically lower if you do pulse watering versus just that traditional like guzzle on the water once or twice a week. So it also, so there's value there with water conservation, which is high on my mind. And it's definitely helped me on my weak well. It's helped me be able to more consistently water. Those long doses of water were really hard on my system. But the other thing that I've noticed and is so powerful and so important is that the plants never get stressed out for water the same way they would otherwise. So if you are irrigating the traditional way where you're just watering once a week or you're waiting for rain or whatever, there are long stretches of time when the soil profile does dry out. Now, it doesn't go to like the point where plants are wilting, but they are sensing that there's not enough moisture in the soil profile. The same is happening with your microbiome. The various, community members in the microbiome are starting to be like, ooh, I don't know, there's not that much water here right now. Maybe we start thinking about going dormant a little bit. I don't know, so whenever there's a real drying out period, you end up with more stress on all parties of the community in that capacity. So by pulse watering, you keep it very consistently just moist, not wet. It's not wet, it's just moist. And when you do that, the growth capacity of plants is mind-blowing. Like I one of my favorite podcasts, and probably one of yours too, Jesse, is John Kemp's. And some of his episodes, he talks with guests about how we don't even know how plants can grow. Like we don't even understand their capacity because we're not giving them exactly what they need. So with pulse watering, you give them the moisture that they need and just these perfect little doses, and you will see robust plant growth like you've never seen before. Crops for me that would maybe max out at 2 feet tall, and for flower farmers, we want things tall, are now like 5 feet tall. So it's just because they have that consistent amount of water, they can grow so much more than they would otherwise. And then pest pressure is lower when you do pulse watering because there's a lot less stress on the plant. So all around, pulse watering is a huge benefit to the entire farm ecosystem. So, yeah.
What are you using for a timer, and do you like it? Or,
I got a little show and tell for those that are watching the video.
There we go. Good.
So for those not watching the video, this is called a dig timer, D-I-G. I get the Bluetooth version. Make sure I can get it close. But it's just it's a hose end timer. So you just hook it up to the garden hose or this, wherever your header line starts. So mine go at the top of the header line. And it's battery operated. So you put 2 batteries in it and they last a long time. Usually the batteries for me last about 4 months. And then there's an app on your phone that you set it up. Through the app, through Bluetooth. You don't need Wi-Fi. I don't have Wi-Fi, so that's important to me to have things that don't need Wi-Fi. You can do Wi-Fi if you want, but you don't need it. And then you program it. So I program it up to 5 times a day, so it'll come on. There's 5 slots per day, and then you can program it for each day of the week as well, and then you can program it for the amount of time each time. So there's 3 variables there. And so, for instance, we're sitting here in my greenhouse right now. The program that I have set up for my greenhouse, which is one zone, it has its own timer, is that it comes on 7 days a week. It comes on 4 times. And this varies through the season. So right now it's a little cooler and shadier this time of the year, so I took it down to 4 times because I didn't need as much water. But so 7 days a week, 4 times a day. Each time it comes on, it's for a 2-minute pulse, and that keeps this house super beautifully moist. Every bed is just absolute perfection. And then out in the field, I'll have to run it for longer. So in the longer outdoor beds, I usually have to put it on for about 10 or 12 minutes at a time. And that's because the bed run is longer. So we all know that it takes more water, more time to fill up the lines, so it's really just about, you got to fill up the lines before any water's coming out. So it takes, you sort of have to, like, as you're setting it up, pay attention and walk your lines and have a little timer going at the same time and see how long it takes to get those lines fully inflated, essentially, and dripping water at the rate you expect to see it. You will time that, maybe it's 2 minutes, maybe it's 4 minutes, whatever. And then, so you have to, like, sort of like, if you're using a scale to weigh stuff, you have to, like, tar it to get it just right. So you need to deduct that amount of time it takes to fill the system and then calculate how much water you need. So maybe you're like, I just want to irrigate for 5 minutes, but it takes 4 minutes for the lines to fill up. So now I have to set the timer for 9 minutes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super helpful. The timer with the filling the lines thing is a smart way of going about it. I would not have thought of that. I mean, I probably would have figured it out eventually that it wasn't fully working, but that's a smart way of going about it.
And what your soil type really makes a difference too. I wanted to make sure to mention that. So if you have a sandy loam like I have a very sort of fast draining soil. You might need to use more pulse watering, more small pulses, but all of them all day, lots of them throughout the day. Or if you have a clay soil that really holds water, then you maybe only have to do like 1 pulse a day because it's going to stick there, it's going to last. So it really has a lot to do with your soil type. There's no prescribed formula for this. You have to get the timers, set them up, and then be incredibly observant for about a week to decide, like, what is the right, algorithm, so to speak, for my timers and for my system and my soil. And the first few days, it won't look like it's working. That's another thing that's really important to point out. It doesn't look like it's working initially because it's just very small amounts of water. It takes a while for it to kind of build up. But you also need to keep track, even after you finally get to that sort of happy spot where it's moist enough and you're like, ooh, I like this. Keep paying attention for a few days, because what might happen is you're oversaturating at a certain point. So you don't want to make it too long, because we all know anaerobic soil, super wet soil, is not healthy either. So you need to find that happy balance. And it does change throughout the season. So warm weather, obviously more water. Cooler weather, less water. So it's not like I set it and forget it. I actually revisit my timers about once a week. But it is nice, they're timers, so they're always going. So I don't have to run around and turn on hoses. I just have to remember to pay attention to them, basically.
And forgive me if you said this, do they have rain sensors on those timers?
They do not have rain sensors, not on this particular one. So if it's rainy, then I go around and I can just turn them off through my phone on the app. It's just a quick click of a button. But I will say that unless it's really pouring rain out and you're getting a heavy rain event, I wouldn't necessarily turn off my pulse watering, because in some ways a little rain every once in a while helps the system stay invigorated. So if it's just a light rain, don't turn off that pulse watering. Let it keep going, basically. Yeah,
that makes sense. When we return, we're going to take one more break, and when we return, one bigger piece of game-changing advice from Jennie. Be right back. Hey y'all, the No-Till Growers crew and I want to use the ad space today to point you towards a couple resources to help farmers in North Carolina directly affected by Hurricane Helene. Both the Organic Grower School, or OGS, and the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, called CFSA, are local ag organizations who have done a lot of work gathering resources for those of us who want to chip in. So their resources will be linked in the show notes, as well as the Appalachian Sustainable Agriculture Project, or ASAP, which was the organization mentioned by Lyric last Tuesday when I spoke with her about her farm's experience with the hurricane. It is impossible to overstate how big of a disaster this is. Sincerely, Helene is one of the worst American disasters since Katrina. So please help if you can, even if just throwing a few bucks towards a farmer's GoFundMe would be huge. Thanks, and back to the show. Jennie, I loved that. First of all, the pulse watering stuff was fascinating. And we do recommend you go and listen to that episode that Jennie recommended. We will put it in the show notes. And let's close out with, I don't know, Jennie, what's a big piece of kind of bigger picture piece of advice for new and beginning farmers or any farmers?
So I always, anytime anybody asks me for an advice, like tell us some advice, I always just go with what's happening in my own life at this exact moment. So,
me too. I do that too.
I have no depth perspective in my, if you ask me any day of the week, it could be different. But right now, and I'll just talk about my season this year. So this is my 16th year of farming full-time, running my own business. And we all know there's so many ups and downs in the farming journey and so many things you're trying to pay attention to and struggle with and all of this stuff. And one of the pieces that I've struggled with the most over the years is maintaining my own ecosystem, I guess is the best way to put it, where my own health, my own capacity, like you can't farm if you're broken, basically. And that unfortunately is where I got to last season. By the end of last season, I had broken all the pieces of my own ecosystem in a lot of ways in the name of wanting to be the best farmer that I could be the best business owner I can be the most successful I can be, because we're brought up in this community where what you can produce is your value. And that can be really exhausting to constantly run that marathon where you think, I have to produce something to be of any worth. I think that's prevalent in our society no matter what, but in our farming community, what we produce, our quantity, is how we, say we're good people, which is a really hard place to be. So I guess my advice would be to remember that your own biome, your own ecosystem is just as important as the soil biome, as the whole big ecosystem at your farm. So I want you guys to start thinking more about supporting, things like your gut flora, like what are you feeding your guts? Because that's a whole community in and of itself. And if you don't feed that, then you don't live, you don't thrive, you can't make a farm thrive. So that is so powerful to me to think about that, and has changed my life. For the record, I am in such better shape this year to handle all the ups and downs that were going on. So yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot about that too with, I talk a lot about sports and that sort of thing, but like as you get older, what you eat and how you exercise. And ironically, I don't know if the listener is going to be able to hear the sirens, but those are not in Philadelphia. That's here in the middle of the countryside here in Kentucky. So shout out to that. You just, the older you get, the more you have to worry about those things too. Your diet, your exercise, like obviously you should always worry about it, but it really has a very like A and B, or very linear, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like almost an immediate effect. You start to feel it a lot quicker and a lot heavier as you get older. And that, at least that's been my experience. And it's especially, I think farmers don't often think about things like exercise, which is something I want to talk a little bit about on Growers Daily at some point.
I'll talk to you about that. I have a lot of thoughts about exercise.
Oh, good. Yeah. I think that's an important topic, because I remember when I was getting into farming, I kept thinking, this is the exercise.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, the same way that an athlete has to work out and exercise just to be able to compete, we sort of have to do that, not to that extent, but like we do have to keep up our health and keep up our hearts and make sure that we're getting some exercise. And the weird thing that happens, at least for me, and maybe you can speak to this too, is that I will exercise in the morning. I'll like ride my bike and all those sorts of things. And then I go out and I have a heavy day of work and I have more energy, which is a surprising, like,
it's shocking,
yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And for me, it was like, I needed to do a lot more strength training. Like at a certain point, for women in particular, our bodies function better if we are building muscle. Maybe not when you're 20, but if you're 40, you definitely need to build some muscle. And you think as a farmer, you're like, oh, I'm strong, but that's not strength training. And that really helps us regulate our insulin levels, our blood sugar levels, which is a big deal. We eat way too much sugar as a society, so that's a big part of it. But then also it helps us manage our cortisol levels and it helps reduce inflammation. So these are things that I think any farmer, any small business owner will struggle with, is inflammation just from stress. We are all so freaking stressed out. Like, I would challenge any listener to say they're not stressed out. I want to know what you're doing. But the amount of stress that we're all carrying around, even if we're, it's a great example of climate change and the extremes that happen. You watch your field either get flooded or you watch your field die a drought. You are stressed. You are just in this chronic state of stress, which means your cortisol is spiked, which means that there's high levels of inflammation in your body. And one of the ways to reduce that cortisol and get the toxic levels out is through sweat, through exercise and sweat, bringing your heart rate up and then letting it rest. So that's really important. And then just making sure you eat things that are feeding the microbiome in your stomach is, I can't say enough about that. I think it's ridiculous how much I spent time worrying about my soil health, which is such an important thing, obviously, absolutely. But I never once thought about my own microbiome. And it is equally important, guys. Like, everybody should be thinking about your biome and supporting it as best you can. And there's something called functional medicine. If anybody wants to kind of dive down that rabbit hole, functional medicine is where I went to kind of get a lot of guidance about this. And yeah, it's life-changing. So take care of yourselves. That is the number one piece of advice I can give anybody, because you can work as hard as you want. But if you can't stand up at the end of the day, if you're in so much pain, you can't walk around, then what was the point, really? So, yeah.
Yeah, you're the most important tool on your farm.
Amen.
You gotta, all the maintenance is a requisite to being able to farm. So, Jennie Love, thank you so much for joining me. I've had a blast. I could do this all the time. You and I can talk endlessly. Yes. I will. Yeah. Well, let's maybe we'll do this again soon.
Let's do it again.
All right. I hope you enjoyed Jennie. That was super fun for me. I will continue to bring on my brilliant friends as guest hosts as often as I can throughout the life of this show, because it's frankly a lot of fun and very fascinating. And I'm just incredibly lucky to have such smart friends. Also, make sure to check out her No-Till Flowers Field Day coming up and her podcast. Follow her on Instagram and all the places. I will put all sorts of links in the show notes, so if you're interested, keep following along. Or you can just look up No-Till Flowers. She will pop up. Like and share this video /podcast if you found it helpful. Make sure you are subscribed or following wherever you are hearing this. Shout out to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No-Till Growers for their support. If you are indeed enjoying this show and want to see it keep going and growing, please consider signing up to be a patron at patreon.com/no-till-growers, where I am shouting out every new member for the month of October. Or if you just bump up from one level to another, you will also get a shout out. Hopefully info like what Jennie shared on pulse watering is worth $2 or $5 a month to you. That's all it takes. A bunch of people basically buying the team at No-Till Growers a cup of coffee. Yeah. You can also snag a copy of the Living Soil Handbook or Dan Brisebois' new book, The Seed Farmer. You can pre-order that now at no-tillgrowers.com, or pick up a hat or other merch. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, that super thanks button is huge for us. Otherwise, I will see you all back here tomorrow for another Growers Daily, and we'll close out with our Patreon shout outs. So huge shout outs today to Matt Falconer. Oh, that's a good last name. I think of, last names often indicate what your family did. And Matt, your family, Falconers. Awesome. Jar, Matt Bartlett, inventor of the pair, and Brad Liston. Huge shout out to whoever supports us in whatever way that you can. All right, thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.